Hi, everyone. The 2024 Environmental Stewardship Award nominations are now open. The ESA Awarding Committee will consider nominees' philosophy and management plan for range and cropland, riparian areas and water, wintering or feeding sites, manure, wildlife and wildlife habitat, and animal welfare. They will also consider nominees' involvement in the community, extension, and environmental stewardship activities, as well as their goals, implementation, and accomplishments. You can find out more about the Environmental Stewardship Award by going to abpdaily.com or albertabeef.org and get those nominations in before 11:59 p.m. on March 15th. I look forward to seeing them in my inbox, Deborah M. at albertabeef.org.
Hey, hello, welcome back to the Bovine. I am your host, Kara Oosterhuis. As always, so great to be here with you. Okay, this just might be me and a little bit of social anxiety, but does anyone else struggle with what to say? Do you say hello? Do you say howdy? Do you say hi? Do you say hey? I often do hey, hi, hello because, well, I can't make a decision to save my life. So let's just go with all three. I would love to hear from you guys, though. You got any fun ways to say hello? Please send them to me, Kara at albertabeef.org. I would love to hear them. Let's have a little fun here. Speaking of fun, it's been a really busy month here at ABP. I got to meet a lot of you at our annual general meeting, which was held in Calgary, and it was so great to be able to see your smiling faces, to be able to, I've interacted with a lot of you guys over social media or things like that. So it's so great to be able to actually meet you guys in person, sit down, have those conversations, find out what's really impacting your operation and how we as an industry can come together to help and overcome some of those hurdles if we can. So always great. It was a couple wonderful days. And following that, actually in Calgary, was the Alberta Beef Industry Conference, which today's show is going to be focused on a few conversations I had at ABIC 2024. Lots of great speakers, lots of great conversations. You'll hear in the background of a couple of these interviews, there was some great chatter, lots of great networking going on. Everyone seemed to be happy to be back together. In this episode, you'll hear Jack Bobo, who is the director of the University of Nottingham's Food Systems Institute, Lance Zimmerman, who is a senior animal protein analyst at RaboResearch Food Agribusiness, Tammy Nemeth, who is a strategic energy and ESG analyst based in the UK, and you might wonder, okay, how does that fit into the agricultural industry? Why was she speaking at ABIC? But she actually talked about lessons we can learn from the oil and gas industry and how we can actually bring those back around to the agricultural industry. So 3 great conversations coming your way. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back with Jack Bobo. As you've heard in some of the other podcasts, I am no stranger to conferences, and I have been to a lot of conferences throughout my short career. I've been to many where Jack Bobo has spoken, but this is the first time I've been able to sit down and chat with him. We talked about a lot of different things, but one thing that stood out to me is he brought up that the choices we make determines the future of our world and agriculture. Jack framed it as a huge opportunity, and maybe this is the negativity coming out a bit, but honestly, I think it's a little daunting. Jack says it's not so much about being radical in our changes to our food systems. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here, and we've been doing so many great things for a long time here, but maybe it's a matter of accelerating the pace of improvement that we are already on. At one point in our discussion, we talk about how important it is to be open-minded, but how many of us actually already consider ourselves open-minded? I think if you talk to most of your friends, most of your family, they'd say, oh yeah, I'm open-minded. But he poses the question of, when was the last time you actually changed your mind, on something you really felt you had an opinion on? When was the last time you changed your mind? And this stood out to me as I would consider myself to be an open-minded person, but I honestly do not know the last time my mind was changed about one of my opinions I feel strongly about. So super interesting thought. Maybe if nothing else, challenge yourself to thinking about when the last time you did this was and where our biases lay. interesting thoughts here. But anyways, I'm not going to spoil it all for you. Check out Jack Bobo now.
Yeah, so I was talking a little bit about how I think many in the agriculture community feel under attack. And I think part of that is that there are a lot of negative impacts of agriculture today. But in order to address that, we need to think about sort of where did we come from, where are we today, and where we hope to be in the future. And so some of the things I discussed were the impact of agriculture on land. 40% of all the land on Earth is devoted to agriculture. 70% of all fresh water comes from agriculture or goes to agriculture. And then in terms of climate change, 10 to 15% of emissions are directly from ag, another 10 to 15% from deforestation. And yet, when you go back and you look at where we've come from, the story is completely different. Farming today is not just better, it's dramatically better than it was 30 years ago, and it will be better 30 years in the future. And so, how do we change our mindset in order to get to that place we want to go?
And one of the things you discussed when you talked about changing your mindset is not necessarily envisioning. I got to think about how you said it. You said we need to stop preparing for the future we don't want, and we need to start envisioning the future we do want.
Yeah, I think most of us, when we think about the future, we ask, what do I think is going to happen, and what should I do to prepare for it? And those are really reasonable questions to ask. That's strategic planning. That's what businesses do every day. But when you think about it, if you're just preparing for the future you expect, you're never going to go anyplace new because you're preparing to go to the most likely future. But if I were to ask you, what's the best future? The best for your industry, the best for your family, the best for the planet, where we're all healthy and nutritious and sustainably producing food, that is not the most likely future. And so if we think about, well, what does that future look like? And then we ask the question, well, what do I need to do next to get to that future? Well, it's just different. The things we need to do in order to get to the best future are different than the things we need to do to prepare for the future that's most likely. And so I think once you recognize that I can choose to go to the future I want, or I can just prepare for the future I expect, I think we would all rather go to the best of all possible futures. We're looking towards the future instead of figuring out where we actually want to go. And this is what we tell people all the time when they're thinking about their future. It's like, well, what do you want to be in 5 or 10 years? And then what do you need to study today to get there? Well, that's how we help people to prepare for their future. But somewhere along the way, we kind of forget that kind of vision of where we want to go because we're all just so busy, right? There's all of these pressures on us. And so we're just busy trying to put out the fires that are in front of us. And so we just don't take that moment, that pause to say, could things be better? And in order for them to be better, what do I need to do?
Why does now matter? We're talking about the future. We're talking about, we look at how the population is supposed to keep growing and growing and growing until 2050. What happens after 2050? Why do we need to focus on now?
So I think when most of us think about the future, we know that we're going from 8 billion to 9.5 billion people by 2050. That's a big number. That means we need 25% more food. And so it's a huge challenge, especially given the problems we have today. And that's where our thinking about the future ends. But if we were to look just a little bit past 2050, what we find is that population growth actually slows dramatically after 2050. And that's because we're not having more kids. We've actually reached peak child. The number of children born next year will be less than this year. 100% of population growth is because of people living longer. It's a good news story. We're just not going to live forever. And so things slow down dramatically. And so the challenge we have is not to produce more and more food with greater and greater impact forever. It's to get to 2050 without cutting down our forest and without draining our rivers, our lakes, and our aquifers. Because if we do, in many ways, we're good forever. And so for me, it's this extremely exciting opportunity. Every day between now and 2050, it gets harder to feed the world. Every day after 2050, it will get easier to feed the world if we haven't screwed things up. And so one of the things I left the audience with was this idea that the next 30 years are not just the most important 30 years there have ever been in the 10,000 year history of agriculture, and they are. They're the most important 30 years there will ever be, And that's why this moment in time is so important, because the choices we make will determine whether agriculture destroys the planet or saves it. And it's this huge opportunity.
Huge opportunity, but I mean, man, that it's daunting too to look at that and go, okay, my time is now. How do we make the most of that time?
Yeah, well, for me, the opportunity is that, and the reason for optimism is that we are doing so much better today than we were 30 years ago. And we will be doing better 30 years from now. It's not a question of doing things radically different than we've done in the past. It's about accelerating the pace of improvement. And so that's not such a crazy thing to do. We want to get to our 2070 goals by 2050. We want to get to our 2050 goals by 2030. And so it's just about accelerating that pace of improvement. And part of that comes from recognizing that when we talk about being more sustainable, if you're a livestock producer, what that really means is, how can we help you to be more efficient? How can we help you to be more productive? How can we help you to reduce costs? How can we help you to reduce, runoff and other things? All the things you want to do anyway. You think of those in terms of the business case for why you need to do it. From a conservation perspective, that's what sustainability is. And so if we can sort of get our language aligned, I think we can help different communities come together to solve problems in a way that's a bit polarized today.
Yeah, and speaking of polarization, you spoke on that as well. You talked about the effect of polarization when people become polarized, how difficult it is to sit and have these conversations that may be difficult or maybe altering in opinions.
Yeah, I think all of us want to be open-minded. And yet, for most people, if you ask them, when was the last time you changed your mind? It's actually pretty hard to remember the last time we changed our mind about, something that's kind of important to us. And so I think the first thing is that, we all need to have a little more humility about just how open-minded we are. The second is to recognize our own biases. And, the more we understand how and when we're biased, the better we can engage with other people about their biases. And what I think you will find most of the time, if you sit down with somebody that you disagree with on many, many things, that the values that underlie it are actually the same. What we end up arguing about is how to get there. So it's how to get to the future. It's not that we want a future that's sustainable, nutritious, and equitable. I think we all want that. And so if we actually have the same goal, then I think we can begin to have conversations that are a little deeper, a little more likely to lead to solutions.
How do we manage all the different cultural ideas when it comes to the future?
Yeah, I think it is challenging. And part of that is helping the general public to appreciate the arc of history in terms of agriculture. Things are wildly better. Things will be better. We should be hopeful. We can do this. And that then I think they will recognize that beating up on agriculture doesn't help anything. Nobody wants to be told what to do, but we all want to do better. And so that change in communication, instead of telling people what they should do, we can talk to them about what we could do if only we work together. And so that change in tone, the same change in language can lead to people working together to solve these problems. We will go twice as fast together as we ever could alone.
And speaking of changing this tone, another thing we often talk about is, and I try and foster this environment of, asking questions, and there are no stupid questions, but in reality, a lot of people don't feel like they can ask questions.
Yeah, and I think that's unfortunate that we often shut people down, or somebody says something that we strongly disagree with, and we either stop listening, or we just tell them they're wrong, instead of trying to understand where they're coming from, reflecting on why we believe what we believe. And that's where I think that sort of open-minded mindset of, sort of questioning ourselves while we're questioning others is something that can help us, even if we don't change anybody's mind. If we change the tone, I think we would make, just huge strides by just having a more civil conversation and sometimes agreeing to disagree. One of the things that I talked about today was the difference between what I call local sustainability and global sustainability. And what I mean by local is that if you reduce the amount of fertilizer and crop inputs, you will have a lighter impact on a piece of land. So that's local sustainability. The benefits are local. but you'll need more land somewhere else because you'll produce less. And global sustainability is about more intensive agriculture where the impacts are local and the benefits are global. And I think we often think that those are just two different ways of seeing the world, and one is right and one is wrong, depending on where you stand. But if instead you looked at that as a continuum of sustainability from local to global, and that there will simply always be trade-offs between the two, well, now all of a sudden you see that you're working towards the same objective, but you have a different emphasis. Well, that's, it's exciting to realize somebody's solving the problem in a different way than you, as opposed to they're doing it wrong and you're doing it right. And so I think that, we often, we're more suspicious of other people's motives. We assume that we have good intentions. We sometimes assume that other people don't. And I think that makes it harder for us to find that common ground.
And I think you brought up a great example. We can sometimes, especially in, this industry, we talk about natural, and some of us might roll our eyes or go, oh boy, you don't even realize the marketing behind there. But our brains just work to kind of, you brought up the example of, okay, when you think natural, you think of bunnies, you think of puppies, you think of springtime, right? But natural can mean other things too, and our brains really have a lot of biases there.
Yeah, I think the more we understand how our brain leads us astray, again, we will make better decisions ourselves. In the example you gave, when you say the word natural, we all think happy thoughts, and yet, E. coli, salmonella, listeria, those are all natural too, but our minds just go to a happy place. And the more we recognize that, then we can start to interrogate some of our other beliefs and see, maybe I was, a little too biased myself. And that kind of self-awareness, I think, makes us better people. I think, from the livestock industry, if I were to ask people, we need 25% more food by 2050, 25% more protein. And if I were to ask people in the livestock industry, should we do that by expanding animal ag? I think most people would say, yeah, animal protein is a great source of protein. It's highly nutritious, and people that don't have access to protein today would benefit from that. And those things are all true. But if we expand animal protein production, we'll probably need to cut down 10 or 20% of our forests, so there will be a huge ecological impact. But if demand increases and supply increases, income is flat for most producers. I mean, that is not a world in which they are thriving. They're just hanging on. And they're more under attack because of all those environmental consequences that are caused by somebody else. And yet a world in which these alternative proteins, or whether it's lentils or pulses or plant-based burgers, in which they expand to meet that protein demand. Well, if demand for real meat increases by 25% and supply is flat, livestock producers are making more money because demand increases and supply is flat, and we don't have all those negative environmental consequences. So they become a super premium product and they're making more money. I think that's a hopeful future, and yet we think of these alternatives as competition, and rightly so, because they often talk about putting them out of business. So I understand why there's that threat. But I think when we think about that from that futures perspective, we realize that it's totally fine to have the same amount of meat production in 2050 if you're all making twice as much money.
And earlier you mentioned that whole 2050, that if we don't screw it up by then. When you say if we don't screw it up, are you alluding to environmental pressures like you just said?
Well, in a few ways. I mean, certainly, I mentioned 40% of the land on Earth is devoted to agriculture. I mean, if we were to dramatically increase livestock production, that would mean more soybean, that would mean more livestock, mostly in Latin America. And so there'd be environmental consequences. In the United States, you have the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the largest in the world, that's being drawn down from water pretty dramatically. And so that's a real threat to our future. And so there are some real challenges that we face, but also in terms of nutrition. 42% of Americans are obese, 75% are overweight or obese. And the world is just following right along. So, I mean, we think of Americans as a particularly large community, and yet obesity rates in America were lower than most of Europe as recently as 1970. This is a really new problem. And so I think nutrition is sort of the other piece. So there's the environmental impact that I think threatens us, and there's that health impact. according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, the cost to our food system of those non-communicable diet-related illnesses is $10 to $12 trillion a year. It's a huge cost. It's $1 trillion a year in the U.S. alone. Imagine if we took some of that money and we spent it on making people healthier instead of making sick people less sick. We could buy a lot of fruit and vegetables for $1 trillion. And, that would lead to, instead of, we wouldn't have to take a pill to get healthier or lose weight. We could just eat healthy food. And so, again, there are things that we could do to imagine a future that we really want to live in.
Now, I wrote this question down here because you posed it to the audience, and I kind of want to turn it back on you. You said consumers won't change what they eat to save their lives. And this comes with, like you said, obesity, all these sorts of things. We know what we eat isn't great for us, but it's hard. It is really hard to change. Why do we think they will change what they eat to save the planet?
Well, I don't think they will change what they eat to save the planet. So I wrote a book in 2021, Why Smart People Make Bad Food Choices. So I tackled this question of why we do what we do. And my conclusion was that it's not that we don't know what we should do. I think we know more about health and nutrition today than we ever have in the history of the planet. We have better food options in the grocery store than we've ever had. We have better nutrition labeling. So it's like by every measure, things should be better, but of course they're wildly worse. And that's because our food environment has changed. We snack more. We eat more processed foods. It's not one thing that's changed. It's lots and lots of little things. And so part of what needs to happen is that we need to change our food environment. If we were all eating a healthier diet, we would simply be eating fewer calories. If we were eating fewer calories, it would probably be a more sustainable package of food. So it's like all of those things work together. And so, but those are not problems that we can individually solve because, it's our entire food environment. When you go to the restaurant, if they serve you twice as much food as you need, you may like that restaurant because they give you good value for your money. But eating 2 meals for the price of one is not good value. Getting 2 meals for the price of one is a great deal. But if you finish it in one sitting, it doesn't help. And so that psychology is working against us. It's not the fault of the restaurant because restaurants give us more food because we come back to restaurants that give us more food. And the cost drivers of a restaurant are real estate and labor, not the ingredients themselves. And so, we need to understand how do we shift that food environment to deliver healthy outcomes instead of fighting it.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts you have for Alberta beef producers or the industry as a whole?
I would just say I would encourage them to find partners in the conservation community, people that get it. Nature United here in Canada, they fundamentally believe if it doesn't work for the producer, it doesn't work. And so the things that they're encouraging them to do and working with them to actually implement are solutions that could work for everybody. And so seek out those voices that are willing to listen to you and work with you in order to make the world a better place and find a way of telling your story because the public needs to hear it.
Fascinating. Even if we don't change people's minds, we can change the tone. I think something definitely to think about. Next up, we've got Lance Zimmerman, who is a senior animal protein analyst at RaboResearch Food Agribusiness based out of Kansas. The cattle industry is no stranger to the record high prices that continue to show, and on the flip, also no stranger to the volatility this creates. With all this volatility, the need for risk management increases even more. As we dive into this conversation, the cost of a quote-unquote bad decision becomes greater. Another topic we touch on is how to encourage new entrances to the market when prices continue to skyrocket. As a young person myself and someone that is surrounded by young people in the agricultural industry, it's such a true point. Yes, you can currently sell your cattle for high prices and you could make a pretty penny off your land, but if you're at a growth stage in your career, how on earth do you grow? Lance and I dive into the markets, what's going on with supply and demand, what the future looks like, some considerations for hedging the futures, and more.
So I grew up on a farm and ranch diversified cattle and farming operation in western Kansas in the United States. The family operation today has a couple hundred head of cows, a couple thousand acres of mostly wheat and corn production. Grew up all around that. My dad basically started the family operation from scratch. And so I grew up a multi-generation farm family, but kind of one generation removed as my dad kind of rebuilt what his grandfather had maintained and his dad had tried to get started before he passed away a little bit early in my dad's childhood. And then had the opportunity for the last 20 months to be the senior beef cattle analyst for Rabobank, working within our RaboResearch team. Prior to that, I worked for CattleFax as a market analyst in Denver, Colorado for a dozen years, worked for Certified Angus Beef, the biggest brand beef company in the globe in North America, in their headquarters in Ohio. But my entire career has been around cattle. It's been fun. Get the chance to work with anyone raising cattle, processing beef, or servicing the beef industry, from pharmaceutical companies to nutrition companies, farm inputs, within this role within RaboResearch. So it's kind of a fun role to be in. And obviously here this week, just talking markets and activity in the industry with all the attendees here.
I find it really interesting within the agricultural industry. I grew up within it, but everyone kind of changes jobs. Like if you're in more of the corporate side, you change jobs, you move around within the industry, but nobody wants to leave ag as a whole. We all kind of stay here within agriculture because it's just, it's a great place to be.
Yep, exactly.
Now, one of the things you talked about today was that chaos creates opportunity. Now, I find this interesting. My partner will laugh at me when he hears this because I am chaos. And maybe sometimes it does create opportunities. So do you want to elaborate a bit on what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think, your audience totally understands this idea that the industry's been chaotic, right? For most of the Canadian beef industry, whether they're cow-calf producers, feed yards, anything in between, it feels like a constant onslaught of chaos for really the last 20 years. But what I mean by that is, as we've navigated across North America and traversed this multi-decade period of the last 30 years, we focused a lot on building consumer beef demand because we recognize how important having a dedicated, diehard, almost evangelic consumer of beef is to the benefit of our ranches, our feedlots, our livelihoods out here in the countryside. But as we've done that, we have introduced some self-inflicted chaos upon ourselves. And what I mean by that is we've continued to have some declining supply of beef, whether it's Canada, the U.S. or Mexico. Per capita supplies have continued to erode. As we've done that, we've faced more contraction. We've faced more price volatility as declining supplies were met with increasing demand. And as a result, we're sitting here and we're seeing record high prices, but we're not really seeing our profit margins shift. Profit margins continue to operate within the same range as they historically have. And so how do we look at this chaos? And we look at it honestly and find ways to find opportunity. And my encouragement to the audience was really looking at ways that we can take some of that attention and effort that we've put towards demand building and put it towards resiliency building so that we can all be more prosperous going forward and stem some of the challenges that we've faced over the last several decades, put them at bay, put them behind us, and move forward in a better place.
And as we talk about all this volatility, there's higher prices, there's higher risks. And do you want to elaborate a bit more on what you mean by higher risks there? As this market continues, why do our decisions become so much more, I don't want to say important, but they do?
Yeah, absolutely. There were a couple things that I talked through as we're having this discussion today. One of them is this idea that I've already alluded to a little bit. We've had increasing demand for really the last 30 years. There have been some ebbs and flows, but on the average, demand has increased 1% to 2% a year since the late 90s. Even if supplies were flat, but that demand increase happened, prices would still trend up over time because steady supplies but higher demand means more price. Yet we've been in an environment where not only has demand gone up, but supplies have gone down. And so we're sitting here today with record high prices. whether it's feeder cattle, calves, fed cattle, boxed beef, even the price of beef in retail stores over the last several months. They've all put in new highs or matched recent highs. Yet, as we've done that, we've also increased volatility around that. And we're just talking about price here. Look at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange futures price, April 2024 futures. It started as a contract in October of 2022. From October 2022 to September of last year, it rallied 20%. 11 months, 20% rally. Then from September 15th to the first week in December, it lost all of that gain. So it took 11 months of gains and wiped them out in 75 days. Then, since those lows in early December, now we've recovered about 60% of that loss. And so you talk about the market implications of that. If you were one of our cattle feeder friends that really leans heavily into risk management, and you were fortunate enough to have your cattle protected into those September highs, you could sit back and enjoy life and cover the bar tab for all your friends who were probably trying to drink their sorrows away from a market that was just getting away from them. And so when we talk about the volatility and the cost of a bad decision, if you weren't hedged, if you weren't using good risk management, and you were looking at cattle that you needed to sell against that April, you're still looking at that price today in the mid 180s and thinking about the what ifs, because you gave up $15 compared to the highs last September. And so when we talk about some of the costs of tough decisions or bad decisions or missed opportunities, that futures contract encapsulates a real world example that's been here and now, right, staring us in the face. The other side of that isn't even market related. Let's just talk about production risk. We've gone through essentially a 15-year period where many areas of Canada and the U.S. have had to talk about 100-year droughts multiple times. Matt Makins earlier today did a phenomenal job talking us through weather patterns and weather-related challenges that face Canadian producers, Alberta producers as a whole. As we think about the risk that's associated in the cattle business, specifically for our friends in the cow-calf segment, when they want to rebuild their herd, it's not a one-time purchase for 1 year and then they move on. They're dedicated to those new replacement heifers, those new bred cows, and they want to make a multi-year investment, have those females on those operations for 5, 8, 10 plus years. Well, if we're sitting here and we've just gone through 2 massive droughts in the last 15, and you heard Matt Makins' weather forecast for the next several years, you're not really wanting to participate in that roller coaster ride right now, because you don't want to purchase heifers today and then you have to sell them as mature cows 3 or 4 years down the road, because once again, you're back in a situation where your pasture resources are stressed. And so the net side effect of volatile prices, volatile climate, is less participation in the business, or increasing prices even higher to encourage new entrants. And that's a dangerous proposition when we have a lot of transition happening across feedlot country, across farms and ranches, all throughout Canada, and specifically in Alberta, where ag is so important. How do you encourage new entrants when prices just continue to work higher? And that's a major challenge that's confronting the industry today.
So do you have an answer to that? I mean, you hear opportunity. There is definite opportunity here.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that is encouraging to me is I do think that younger producers see the opportunity. I do truly believe they're equipped to handle some of these challenges that we're talking through right now, Kara. The one thing that I'm encouraging the industry to do as we think about this industry more seriously going forward is we need to find a way to preserve our independent nature as cattle producers. We want to continue to see a cow-calf business that thrives on their own, a feed yard segment that thrives on their own, a packing segment that does the same. But we also got to be willing to lend a hand to those other segments and say, hey, what can you do to help my business be better, and vice versa? And so one of the things I talked about was, hey, there's a great opportunity that still exists in this business to improve coordination from one segment to the next. I call it vertical coordination. Most people do, not vertical integration, where in a pork and poultry segment, we talk about everyone owns the animals all the way to the end product. This is different. Each ownership of each segment maintains its independence. but they work together. And I think technology is another thing that allows some of that coordination to happen, allows us to share data better from one segment to the next, but also then maybe creates a more efficient market signal where we can capture a premium from the consumer and more efficiently get it priced all the way through the supply segments, where the processor can get rewarded a little bit, the feed yard can get rewarded a little bit, and they can hand a little bit down to the cow-calf guy too. And all through this, build a system where everybody has assurances. The cow-calf guy knows his calves have a home at this feed yard. This feed yard knows that once those calves become fed cattle, they have a hook space available for them at the packing plant. The packing plant knows when that product's boxed up, it's got a home at these retailer and these restaurant locations. Technology will allow more efficiency to drive that coordination, but also technology will just allow better management of the records, the hand-holding, the coordination it'll take to make some of those things happen. And so I think vertical coordination and technology kind of happen hand in hand. And then one that's related, but maybe not as intricately wound together with those other two ideas, is this concept of policy engagement. We know, and I mentioned it to everybody in the room and they laughed, in the U.S. we joke that you get a little concerned when a government official sets foot on your operation and says he's there to help make your life easier. Everybody in the room chuckled, so I'm guessing in Canada they must get the same trepidation and fear when those words are uttered on their own operations. But the reality is the government's more and more involved in our day-to-day lives today than they were yesterday, and they're going to be more involved in our lives tomorrow than they are today. And so my call to action for the audience was, well, let's make sure if that's the case, and that seems like a given based on past history, that how they're involved in our business is 100% beneficial. Whether that's facilitating generational transfer, whether it's helping lessen some of these production risks, whether it's environmental risk due to climate shifts, whether it's price risk due to market shifts, whether it's just helping us navigate some of the challenges that exist in food production today. The government has a willingness to facilitate some of those pain points and make them less challenging for us. Let's make sure the policy that government wants to come up with is policy that actually works in favor of us.
And I think that might be a bit of a, I don't want to say barrier to entry, but when you're looking at opportunity for the next generation, policy is huge. We are afraid, I think, in some ways. And I think you bring up great points, and this has been made a few times throughout this conference, that we need to face some of these challenges head on.
Correct. And I mean, there is a great amount of opportunity, I think a great amount of optimism here at the meetings this week, because we all recognize prices are trending higher for all classes of cattle and beef. Also, input costs have been trending lower, in some cases dramatically lower over the last several months. And so we all sense a margin opportunity ahead of us. At the same time, we also recognize that as those prices trend higher, those could create some limitations to robust expansion of the cow herd going forward. So let's address some of those pain points. Let's take advantage of this time period that's in front of us. I would say the time horizon is probably the next 5 or 10 years where prices are going to be very supportive to the cattle producing segments. So let's address some of these pain points along the way while we're prosperous. A lot of times we're tempted when prices are trending higher to sit on our hands a little bit, and then we only want to come up with solutions when margins are working the other way. My plea to everyone here this week is, hey, now's the time. Let's address some of these challenges while they're not quite as daunting as maybe they have been the last several years, and really make some headway so that when times cyclically turn, and we know they will, that we're not all sitting here and looking at this window of time we're in today as a missed opportunity.
Let's switch gears a bit, talk beef demand, and consumer consumption. Where are we at there?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about it today. We're in a place right now where beef supplies are declining. Whether you look at the U.S., Mexico, or Canada, we talk about per capita consumption a lot. Whether it's per capita consumption, you hear the words per capita supply, per capita disappearance. Don't get confused. They all three mean the same thing. It's a very simple equation. It's just production minus exports plus imports divided by the number of people in each country. We're basically sitting here today in a situation where Canada's per capita supplies are going to drop about pound a person or so probably in this next year. In the U.S., probably about 1.5 to 2 pounds. Mexico is going to see a slight correction lower as well. But even with that said, it's not a demand metric, it's a supply metric. And I talked about the cow herd earlier. 2 of those 3 countries still have a declining cow herd. Canada's cow herd's probably going to be, we haven't got the January 1 numbers yet, but based on what I'm hearing,
StatsCan did give the
did it
January
just come
1st,
out?
You betcha.
While I'm here, was it down about 2.5-3%?
Yes, you bet. That's they said it had hit lows since 1989. I think the lowest.
Yep. Okay. So I thought that we were knocking on the door of that release. So fantastic. So, 2.5 to 3% lower. It was about the same in the U.S. You mentioned lowest since 1989. In the U.S., it's the smallest cow herd since the 1950s. What's interesting is our friends in Mexico, their cow herd's at a 20-year high and trending higher. And we talked about that today. Since 2015, Mexico's added 1.2 million cows to their cow herd. They're knocking on the door of 8.4 million cows right now based on our forecast for this year. While, again, multi-decade lows for Canada and the U.S. And so to turn that tide higher, we need to get the cow herd rebuilt. We got to kick it back into production mode. We're doing some great things with technology. If you look at the cow herd in the U.S. and Canada today, we basically produce an extra 250 to 300 pounds per cow today compared to where we would have been 40 years ago. So just phenomenal efficiency gains. We don't need to rebuild the cow herd back to 1970 levels. But if we can get some stabilization, keep some operators in business, and give some hope that these operations can continue to exist for generations to come, that's where we can get those gains in consumption to stabilize out.
So let's switch gears, look a little bit at the price forecast. Demand will dictate the impulsiveness of the uptrend as beef supplies fall.
Yeah, one of the big concerns that I think everyone has is, are we at risk of pricing ourselves out of the market for consumption? And a lot of comparisons are made to 2015 when we recognize those prices, a fun Canadian term I've heard since I've been here, those prices hockey sticked higher, right? You don't get that term in Kansas where I'm from. But we all also recognize that they broke aggressively into the 16, 17 lows as well. The big difference in 2015 compared to today is per capita beef, pork, and poultry supplies in 2014 and 15 were at multi-decade lows. Not only was the Canadian and U.S. cow herd in contraction mode, but pork and broiler industries were facing a lot of animal disease challenges. That was the first round of high-path avian influenza. That was porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. We had all sorts of chaos that caused massive amounts of contraction in the U.S. animal protein space, the Canadian animal protein space, and even Mexico. We hit 2016. All the competing protein industries, they can ramp up that factory really quick. And we had a 9-pound increase on a per capita basis of pork and poultry in North America, and it shocked the market. So we were flooded with cheap protein, and the beef industry was just hoping to rebuild. That doesn't exist right now. Those segments are healthy. They're not expanding. In some instances, they're trying to contract just ever so slightly. And so we don't have to be worried about the U.S. and Canadian and Mexico consumer being flush with cheaper alternatives. The other thing that we can all think about is consumer incomes today versus 2015 are much, much higher than they were during that last price run-up. And one of the things that I've mentioned to folks is if you look back in 15, we actually peaked the number of minutes that the median income earner, middle income earner in North America had to work for a pound of beef. It was about 15 minutes for a pound of AA grade or choice USDA beef. It was about 10 minutes for a pound of ground beef. Today, we're sitting at 13 minutes for the higher quality fresh beef and about 8.5 minutes for ground beef. So we have some room that the consumer can get to based on where they're at with their income today. It would suggest we can get the calf market, and this is U.S. based. I'll do an adjustment for our Canadian friends here. But as we get to the cycle highs, even with just steady demand from where we are today, we can get calf prices back to $4 a pound on an annual average basis U.S. So as we think about that, add roughly 35% for currency adjustment for those of us here in Canada. Essentially, you're talking about a market that would be $5.50 to $6 on a calf basis here in Canada. So clearly there's more upside, even if we just assume steady demand. And as I mentioned earlier, historically, since the late 90s lows, demand's grown about 1% to 2% a year on average.
I would have thought that number would have been much higher when you're looking at the minutes specifically. That I would have thought it would have grown, not decreased from that 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting way to look at it. One thing I was going to bring up now, when you were looking at the declining North American cow herd, we saw the continent had lost about 20 million since the 1975 highs, as you said. However, there is an outlier, and it's Mexico. Why? What's going on here?
No, it's a great observation. So yes, over the long run, multi-decades, we've had a contraction in the cow herd. But if you just look at since 2015, Mexico does stand out. It's kind of like the old Sesame saying, one of these things does not look like the other. Mexico's cow herd has grown about 20% since those 15 lows. Essentially what it means on a numbers basis is they've added 1.2 million cows since 15. Contrast that with Canada and Mexico, where Canada and the U.S., where we've lost about 1.3, 1.4 million cows total in those two countries. It's quick to say, well, what's different there? And one of the things that I mentioned to folks is the easy thing to say is, well, they have a much more vertical integrated relationship between the feed yard and the packer. That's true, but that's existed long before 2015. One of the things that's really exciting is in Canada and the U.S., we focused a lot on increasing that percentage of fed cattle that grade AAA or grade prime. In Mexico, they're also focused on upgrading their quality, but the quality increase that they've done is upgraded their beef to what we're more similar to seeing as single A here in Canada or select in the U.S. And that serves a very valuable role because for Canada and the U.S., we are not producing as much of that lower quality fed product. We're focusing our efforts on the uber high quality product. And so that's created an opportunity for Mexico to fill a niche that we've left behind in Canada and the United States, but benefit some real herd growth for those operators there in spite of continuing drought challenges there as well.
And now I realize I'm jumping here, there, and everywhere. Remember the chaos from the beginning. We're creating some good chaos. When we're looking at these replacement heifers and we're looking at rebuilding the herd, you brought up a really fascinating, you called it your quick cowboy math. Do you want to give our listeners a bit of an insight into that?
Yeah. So, one of the other concerns as we talk about those calf price highs is we look longer term out to 2026, probably more than likely even 2027. The concern becomes, well, man, I love the bigger calf check every time I sell a calf, but then there's some trepidation and fear that starts creeping in because you realize, but I probably want to rebuild the cow herd too. And if I'm having higher calf prices, I'm going to have to pay more for bred heifers and cows. And so going back to that same price high of a 5-weight steer calf bringing $4, a general rule of thumb we have in the industry is that as we go through expansion phases, it takes roughly 1.8 calves to pay for a cow. Today, it's more closer to 1.5 calves to pay for a cow. If we just round that 1.8 up for easy math on a podcast to 2, and we talk about that $4 calf price, that calf's worth $2,000, 2 calves takes that up to $4,000. Then we got to do that Canadian adjustment, right? And so we're talking about a price for a Canadian bred female, $4,500 to $5,000 a head is what we're talking about as we get out to that price high. It's basically $1,000 more than what we see roughly in the marketplace today. There's a massive range around the average on bred female prices based on quality, based on pasture resources in an area. But rough rule of thumb, we're probably looking at a bred female cost that's probably going to cost us $1,000 more at the cycle highs than where they are today. Again, on the assumption that just consumer demand just kind of treads water. The biggest thing we can do when we go into these periods, again, as I said, we know prices are going to trend higher for cattle and beef, barring some kind of major recession that nobody's really forecasting right now. Input costs are getting much more in line than anything we've seen over the last 18 months. There's margin opportunity that's here. And so the biggest thing that we can do as operators is focus on the buy. Our margins historically are bought, not sold. And so let's make sure as we're procuring calves for grazing, we're procuring grazing cattle for the feed yard to finish, as we're looking at acquiring some bred heifers or even some pasture, that we're not handcuffing ourselves to a really high buy, so that we have that opportunity to grow that margin going forward. Because we're in an environment where the cow herd in Canada and Mexico is continuing to drift lower. Feed yard supplies are still very ample because we had to rush a lot of calves into the feed yard due to all this drought. As we go forward, those supplies are going to get drawn on. We're going to have a steady uptrend in these prices. So we just got to stay disciplined. The margin's going to be there, and we're going to reward the disciplined buyers in this marketplace. And then once we have those cattle procured, it all leans down to good management. And so let's focus on the buy. Let's focus on good risk management. And producers that do that are going to be rewarded, not just in the short run, but over the next several years.
I meant it when I said I was a bit thrown by that minutes thing. How many minutes it takes to work for a nice steak or a pound of ground beef. I really would not have thought those numbers would have gone down, but I think it's a neat way to visualize, especially for those outside of the agricultural industry that may not be as closely connected and tied to their food and the production of their food as we are. Now, my next conversation, this was a bit of a different conversation, as I said in the intro, as although Dr. Nemeth actually grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan, she left the agricultural industry and primarily focuses on the oil and gas industry. However, we know there are a lot of comparisons when it comes to advocating for our industry and some of the policies we are up against. How can we get ahead of the conversation? What lessons can we learn from what oil and gas has already faced? Here's Dr. Tammy Nemeth.
I have a PhD in history. I did oil and gas relations of Canada and the United States. And I've always had an interest in the energy industry. That's what my research has been. And I taught at a university in Germany. And then we moved to the UK and decided to do research and consulting, mostly in the oil and gas field, and the sort of challenges that are being presented globally with respect to oil and gas resource development, not just in Canada, but in other places in the world too.
So one of the questions that kind of came up here today is, can we survive the net zero branding? Oil and gas has absolutely faced this net zero branding, but we are now really starting to see this in the agricultural sector, specifically in the livestock sector here. Do you want to talk about your messaging there?
Well, one of the lessons that I think is the most important from my presentation is the importance of communication and communicating your story. And the oil and gas industry in Canada, even though it is like one of the most efficient industries in the world, was so labeled as being this terrible place and so on. And I encountered that when I was in Germany. I gave a lecture about the regulatory system of Alberta's oil sands and how oil and gas regulations were. And the students came up to me afterwards and said, "So how much did the industry pay you to make that speech or give that lecture?" I said, "What are you talking about? That's how it works. This is the regulatory structure." And they didn't want to believe it. And so what the livestock industry needs to do, the beef producers need to do, is be able to communicate their message to the broader public before it gets sort of diluted by the negative aspects. So, for example, in Europe and the UK even, they're looking at trying to eliminate meat production. And so there was the case in Ireland where the farmers are told they have to cull 200,000 cattle over the next 4 years to meet their net zero targets. If you want to fight that, if you want to push back against it, you really have to get the public on your side, because ultimately it ends up being how many people can you get on the street to defend you? And this is where the environmental groups have been so successful in, whether they get real protesters or they pay protesters or whatever to get out on the street and do these PR stunts and so on. But I think the average Canadian loves their ranchers and would be open to hearing more about that.
And I think, though, one of the tough things is we look at, okay, yes, we need to communicate, but we need to communicate outside of our industry as well. We need to not just talk to each other about how great ranching is and what it does for the environment and what it provides, but talk to people who aren't at all aware of what goes on.
Absolutely, especially people in the city who have no idea where their food comes from, and they'll get whatever viewpoint they have from social media or from something else, but to have that sort of outreach, or get people maybe who used to be or have relatives or something who can set up a little group and start to talk about it in other places. And I'm sure there's lots of creative people out there who can come up with great ideas on how to do that. I guess my point would be it needs to be done, and I hope that you have people who can do that.
So if you're saying we need to communicate to people, how do we communicate to people that already have their minds made up?
That's a very good question, and it's a conundrum because particularly when you're dealing with governments and you're sitting at a table trying to figure out what's the best policy or the best regulation and so on, and quite often those people will already have their minds made up. They have an end goal in mind, and it's kind of like, how can you be cajoled and persuaded to continue on that trajectory to this other outcome that they want? And I don't know what precisely the solution is to that. I think it needs some thought, maybe some brainstorming. Maybe AI can help, as we heard from one of the other presentations. But there needs to be a way to strategize about how to do that. How to do that is maybe saying, you know what, we're not going to participate in these talks because we don't think they're being done in good faith. We think you already have an outcome in mind. So why on earth would we waste our time and compromise ourselves? Maybe that's an option. I don't know.
I think in some ways the world as a whole, we tend to be quite negative, and we're really focused on these negative impacts. How do we change the conversation to look at the positive impacts?
Just keep talking about the positive impacts and saying, you know what, there's trade-offs. There's trade-offs in everything we do. For example, I know some people up who've done a lot of work in the Arctic, and there was someone had put together an oral history of a lot of the different people up in the Arctic, and there were trade-offs that they were willing to make between getting off the ice, where people would live to be 30, where the children would be dying, and then they were offered a home, and where they didn't have to go on the ice anymore, and they had to give up parts of what it's like to live on the ice for that safety and protection. There were trade-offs. And if you talk to elders, they would say that was the right decision because we got to live longer, we got to see our children live, and so on. There are other people who will say, well, no, we gave up culture and all these other things. But we can have that conversation about what are the trade-offs. Because with the beef industry, for example, all we hear about is the negatives and not about what do the beef and the cattle do for grasslands, about keeping the soil healthy because they're walking around ruminating on it or whatever. So there's trade-offs there. And so, I mean, if you look at the prairies in Canada, for example, it used to have millions, tens of millions of buffalo running around. And now we have cattle. But if we take the cattle away, what happens to the land that's used to having large livestock on it, whether it's buffalo or whatever? And if we remove the cattle, then what happens? Doesn't that affect biodiversity?
When we're talking communication specifically here, what lessons can be learned by what is going on in the EU right now? There's a lot there.
Yeah, the farmers there, as I mentioned in the talk, have been really had the rug pulled out from under them, because under the Common Agricultural Policy, the farmers would get paid to be farmers. And, there were certain criteria, and over time, the criteria has become a little bit more stringent. But this time, they negotiated a new deal. And in order for the farmers to get the payments they would have normally gotten, they now have to meet certain conditions, subscribing to different sustainable programs. So they would have to install solar panels on their barns at their own expense. They would have to monitor different emission levels around their property. They have to leave certain buffer zones. They have to take out 4% of their land from production and rewild it. And then there's also the push to make 25% of all current agricultural land in the EU organic by 2030. 25%. I mean, oh my gosh, that's there. How do you do that? How do you do that? And so the farmers wouldn't get their money to keep farming unless they did all these different things. And they would have to have a third party verifying that they're actually complying with what the law says. And that's one of the reasons why the protests are still ongoing. They were at Brussels last week and starting tires on fire. They really like to do that in Europe for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. Makes lots of black smoke and whatnot. But yeah, they're fighting back because otherwise they don't get paid and they're not farming.
I should have said this the beginning, but you kind of broke down into 3 different lessons we can learn from the oil and gas industry. And as you said, our lesson, one of those most important lessons was communication, but another one you brought up is understanding is power. Do you want to kind of elaborate for the audience on what you meant by that?
Well, understanding is power means that you need to know what you're up against, who you're up against, and what their ultimate goal is. And with respect to the beef industry and farming, it's about I'll look at farming first. For farming, it's about going organic. That's the end goal, is that most of the farming will be done organically. And one of the top lobby groups in the EU is a peasant farming lobby group, where they want people to go back to peasant farming, which is ridiculous. And then for beef and livestock, it's to stop eating meat. So if you look at, for example, the Eat Lancet study that came out, I think it was in 2017 or 2019, where they decided that meat should only be like this really, really tiny portion of your diet, which would be like maybe once a week you would have 4 ounces of chicken or something, where meat is a treat. That's the ultimate goal for the livestock and meat industry, and in particular beef. Beef is the number one target right now. I think eventually it'll be the moving goalposts thing again, where they'll get the beef first, then they'll go after the hog producers, then they'll go after the sheep farmers, then they'll go after the chicken. So it's this progression to get people off meat. And if you read through what the EU Green Deal farm to fork strategy is, it says it. It says that's what, by 2050, it'll be this. And if you read the academic literature where they're talking about what's a sustainable diet, the sustainable diet is almost no meat. So, that if you understand that, and one of the other things I made, points I tried to make was, you might think that's ridiculous. You might think that's an absurd goal, but that's their goal. And if you understand that's the goal, then you can understand better the policies that they're putting in now in order to get to that goal. It's like a chess game where you know what you want to do. You want to capture the queen. And so you're moving your pieces around the board in order to do that. And you have an opponent who's moving their pieces, and sometimes you shift your strategy, but your goal is still the same. And this is what you're up against. They want beef con, they want meat out of our diet, and they're doing these moves in order to achieve that. And if you know that, you can fight it.
I'll never be against advocacy, and we need to speak up for all these different things. But are we a little late to the conversation here? When you look at oil and gas, is this something that we should have really realistically been pushing hard on 10 years ago?
Well, I think 10 years ago, people thought, well, that's crazy. Who would do that, right? That won't happen. And that was the same kind of attitude of the oil and gas industry. And 4 years ago, I saw that this was where the trajectory was going because the EU Green Deal had just been announced. I was looking at their farm to fork. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is really bad. So, and then I started to see kind of frightening things coming out of Ottawa and different activist groups. And so I had contacted a couple of agriculture groups and said, I just want you to know this should be on your radar. Maybe take an opportunity to think about how to strategize pushing back against this. And all I got was, Canadians love our product. They'll never do this. So, you can take a horse to water. You can take a horse to water, but the groups have to understand what it is so that they can fight it. And now that you know, hopefully something can be done.
Wow, and like you say, just really fully understanding what you're up against, and understanding what is a stakeholder here?
Yeah. So one of the things I mentioned was this shift in the idea of a stakeholder. And in the oil and gas industry, being a stakeholder meant you actually had skin in the game. You were being somehow physically affected, or it was going to affect your land. And so therefore you had a status to address like a National Energy Board inquiry about a pipeline route or something like that. And in around 2011, 2012, the rules were changed where they opened the floodgates, and it was anybody who had an opinion about something could then express their discontent about a pipeline route or development or whatever. And we saw that recently, actually, in British Columbia, where they have an impact assessment for some LNG terminals. And they opened up the comments, and there were people from America, from Las Vegas, sending in comments, people from Europe sending in comments. It's LNG in BC. What business is it of theirs on whether or not this gets developed? And what I see happening with livestock producers and beef producers and so on is that you're getting the activist groups who have an interest in agriculture, and they're really not involved at all, but yet they're the ones who get to have a say on whether or not they do methane controls on beef production, or if you have to use less fertilizer, or if you can't use antibiotics on your cattle, and all of these different kinds of things. They want to have a say. Why should they? It's not directly affecting them.
So one of the things you mentioned too when it comes to stakeholders is even just looking at CO2 and methane and how they don't even use the same numbers. We always talk about methane and everyone wants to reduce methane, but you talk about CO2 and they use parts per million, and methane they use parts per billion. And I mean, that's a huge difference. That's not just one letter like I just flubbed up here. It's a big set of difference there.
Yeah, and yet they're being discussed as if they're on the same level playing field, right? Like as if you're equating apples to apples, but it isn't. When you're using, the digits are different, but which is why it's always sort of abbreviated to, ppm and ppb. Instead of saying it. If you say it, it's like, wait a second, what? Parts per billion versus parts per million? So if I gave an example, let's say that our table here was filled with 1 million little dots, and 400 of them would be CO2. The number of methane in that table of 1 million dots would be 1. And yet we have to take that 1 out, apparently.
So moving into kind of your last lesson you said here today, beware of moving goalposts. This, I think, is a huge frustration for many across the world, but in Canada here, we're looking at the goalposts continuously moving. That creates frustration, that creates unrest, that creates all sorts of problems. We don't even know what we are headed towards. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, and it also creates a lot of uncertainty, right? So if you're trying to plan ahead and with cattle, it's not just every year, but you're looking farther down the field, and you don't know, is the regulation going to change next year? What's the new thing going to be? Are they going to ratchet it? Why do things keep changing like that? And I think the Europeans again provide an interesting example because with respect to agriculture, the Dutch have faced 20 years of moving goalposts. And every time the goalpost moved, they complied and they said, okay, we'll become more efficient. We'll do this, we'll do that, just as everything they said, until the point now where it's like, okay, we've moved the goalposts as far as we can for that, because you're like super efficient. They're the most efficient farmers in Europe. And now we're just going to shut you down. So it's like with the oil and gas industry, they did the same things with the emissions. First it was emissions intensity, and then it was emissions in the plant, and then it was no, the emissions overall in your operations, and now it's an emissions cap, and it's like it's ever moving. And I'm not really sure how to stop the moving goalpost, but at least if you're aware that they're going to be moving, maybe they can be anticipated and some pressure can be brought to bear to stop them before they're moved.
Absolutely. Now, before I let you go, there was one other question I wanted to ask. Water use in the aqueduct program, how does this play into visits to the bank? You talk about drought, how this is so widespread across the prairies, but it causes problems when it comes to whether we are marked as sustainable or not.
Yeah, so that's one of the disconcerting aspects of the disclosure standards is how are they ranking sustainability? Because the standards are meant for banks and insurers and investors. And so they're going to be looking at, when you provide whatever data, there's probably boxes they'll want you to tick. And with respect to water, all they want to know is whether or not you operate in an area of high or extreme high water stress. Well, that's pretty much all of southern Saskatchewan, southern Alberta, and parts of Manitoba. So if you're even operating in that area, you just say, why, yes, I am. And then if they have a sustainable checklist to say, look, we're about making sure that there's that water's preserved, that we're not taking too much water. And I'm sorry, you're operating in an area of high stress. Maybe we shouldn't give you the financing you need. Maybe we shouldn't insure you because it's likely there's going to be a drought. And maybe you should move your operations elsewhere. Who knows how this is going to play out in the end. And I don't think banks really understand how this is going to play out. Although I know some people who were at Agribition in Saskatchewan, and they were taken to a side meeting with some of the major banks that finance agriculture, and they said, "How would you feel about differential interest rates?" And they said, well, "What do you mean?" And the bank said, "Well, if you comply with all of these sustainability things that we would like you to do, we will give you an excellent interest rate and maybe a line of credit. But if you don't comply, you'd have to pay this higher interest rate, and then we're not really quite sure if we'd want to fund you because we're all about sustainability." And the farmers were kind of like, whoa, where's this coming from? So
it's no longer a credit risk, it's an emissions risk.
It's an emissions risk.
That's all for this episode of The Bovine. I am your host, Kara Oosterhuis. Thanks for coming along on that journey with me. It's a very foggy day here today in southern Alberta, so talk to me in 90 days. Maybe we can celebrate a rain together. Maybe. Cross your fingers and your toes. Stay tuned to ABP Daily and your favorite podcast apps for our next episode. And hey, maybe you even have an idea for a future show. Or you see me out and about with my headphones and my microphones and probably a big backpack on my back. You see me, come say hi. I'd love to hear from you. A question maybe you'd like us to answer, or maybe you just want to share where you're listening from. Get in touch on social by tagging Alberta Beef Producers and using the hashtag ABPsTheBovine. Or you can personally catch me on my email, kara@albertabeef.org.